So today we're going to be looking at the next behavioural psychologist or behavioural theory. So Pavlov was a behaviourist and Skinner is a behaviourist as well, which means they both believe that behaviour is learned. So our behaviour is learned from our environment. So this is Skinner. Pavlov was in the turn of the century, so around the 1900s. Skinner's a little bit more current in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. But not quite as current. So he's another one that within the whole of the classroom or the educational environment you're working in, operant conditioning is probably a very effective tool to use, but to use it on its own would be too simplistic. So just approach these with caution. They are quite old-fashioned. So Pavlov liked dogs, Pavlov liked dogs, Skinner was a fan of rats. So he invented Skinner's box, which is a rat would be placed in the box and they'd happily run around and they'd be running around and eventually they might catch by mistake a lever and some food dropped out. They don't even think about it, just some food has appeared. So then they carry on running around again and they catch the lever again, another bit of food drops out. They think, okay, that's interesting. So they start to stay that end of the cage maybe and run around again and they catch the lever and they get the food. And then they start to realise that pressing the lever is what gets them the food. So eventually, Skinner trained rats to press a lever to get food, and that's called positive reinforcement. The food was added to increase the behavior of pressing the lever. Okay, so that's positive reinforcement. Skinner used lots of other animals, so we had pigeons as well. So he trained pigeons to tell the difference between a Monet and a Picasso because he would show the image, and when the pigeon pecked, if it was, I can't remember which way around, but let's say if it was a Monet, the food would drop out, whereas the pigeons very quickly learned that if they pecked when it was a Picasso, which looked very, very different from a Monet, that they wouldn't get any food. So that he trained them to be able to tell the difference between those. Originally, Skinner's research came from the hope of training pigeons by training them where to peck on a certain part of the screen, to train them to navigate planes or some kind of weapon in the Second World War, so they didn't have to have human pilots as well. He also trained pigeons to play ping pong, which is always disappointing. You can go on YouTube. It's not ping pong. It's not pigeons holding little bats, but there is a little table and a net as well. And he also trained pigeons to be superstitious, which is a bit of an interesting one. Something else that he did, he also studied dogs. So he found that dogs learnt that if they went and so the dog would be put in a cage and that it would be electrocuted, and the dog would learn that if it laid or stood on a certain part of the cage, the electric shock would stop. So Pavlov trained dogs to lay on a certain part or step on a certain part of the cage, and that's called negative reinforcement. So the dogs learned that if they stood on this certain part of the cage, that would remove the stimulus of the electric shocks. So they were more likely to do that behavior. So that's negative reinforcement, removing a stimulus to increase a behavior. The electric shocks are removed by increasing the behavior of laying or touching the certain part of the cage. Okay. So Skinner is all about consequence. Pavlov was about association, so pairing things together. Skinner is all about learning the consequence of a behaviour, which arguably does sound a little bit old-fashioned. Okay, so positive is adding something, negative is removing something, reinforcement is increasing a behaviour, and punishment is decreasing a behaviour. So you can have positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, and negative punishment. So positive reinforcement is adding something to increase the behaviour. For example, you had the rats, the food was added, and so the lever pressing behaviour was increased. We've got negative reinforcement, which is removing something to increase a behaviour. So the electric shocks were removed, so the behaviour of laying or sitting on a certain part of the cage was increased. You can have positive punishment, so adding something to decrease a behaviour. So for example, not that I would recommend this, and some people might argue from my other videos, my other lessons, that I'm a bit obsessed with this, but for example, if we stick with animals, perhaps kicking a dog would be adding something to reduce the behaviour of crying or barking. So that would be positive punishment. Remember, positive and negative don't mean good or bad. They just mean adding something or removing something. And then negative punishment would be removing something to decrease a behaviour. So it would be taking away a child's iPad because they had a fight with their brother or sister. Okay, we've got a couple more examples here, and I've tried to keep them educational focused without stealing from you, so you can still have unique ideas. So a really typical one, and this runs all the way from early years, all the way probably up to college. I know that I've done this before. So stickers on a chart for some sort of good behaviour. So I didn't have stickers on a chart for good behaviour, but I did put stickers on a chart to help people track how many additional extra essays they had done. And that's positive reinforcement. So the adding of the sticker, the adding of a stimulus to increase the behaviour of the good behaviour or the behaviour of doing an additional essay. For me, negative reinforcement, so telling students they don't have to do homework at home if they finish it in class. So this is where we want to encourage the behaviour of doing work in class. So we remove the threat of doing homework at home to increase working in class. So removing homework to increase the behaviour of doing work in class. And then we've got the traditional detention for missing homework. So that's a positive punishment. Remember, positive doesn't mean good or bad, it just means different. So positive, adding something, the detention, to reduce the behaviour of missing homework. So positive, adding something, the detention, and punishment to reduce the behaviour of missing homework. And then taking merit points away when a student behaves poorly. So I don't know if this is something that you might have had at school, but you get merit points. So negative punishment would be removing the merit points to hopefully reduce the poor behaviour that the student was showing. If you've understood exactly positive reinforcement, positive punishment, and negative punishment, then you're doing really, really well. If you haven't quite got them, but you've got the rough idea, like you know it's some type of reinforcement or some type of punishment, that is absolutely fine. One final thing to add is the order that I've put them on the slide there is the order of effectiveness generally. So positive reinforcement is most effective in changing a behaviour, then negative reinforcement, then positive punishment, then negative punishment. So as educational professionals, it's really important for you to bear in mind that punishment is not as effective as reinforcement. It's easier to encourage a behaviour than it is to stop a behaviour. So instead of trying to change, so a good important way to think about it might be, instead of trying to change and remove bad behaviours, can you work on increasing good behaviours in your students, positive behaviours that you want to see? Okay. Something that you can do if you want, so I will put some links, I'll attach them somewhere that you can find them. So in the comments below the video when I share it on Teams, you can do a Kahoots and you can do it independently on your own, and it'll help you try and identify, is it positive, negative, punishment, reinforcement. Okay, so that's something for you to practice. And then our reflective task, I would like you, if you can, to identify a time you've experienced all the 4 different types: positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, negative punishment. And ideally they can be in education in the classroom, but actually you learn everywhere all of the time, so it could be absolutely anywhere. And then I would like you to consider, how did each of those experiences make you feel as a learner, or if it's anywhere, as a human? And that's really important because it might help reinforce and help you understand which ones would be most effective. I know for me, when I get punished, so if someone's trying to reduce a behaviour that I'm doing, I'm very stubborn. I don't particularly like it. Again, I go into that ego protection, and I don't really want to engage with it, and I'm tempted to carry on misbehaving. However, if somebody tells me I'm doing a good job and wants to reinforce a positive behaviour in me, I'm all for that. I love that happening. So it's useful for you as a learner to think about how that works for you, and therefore potentially you could and then you could apply it to your practice in your classroom. And then application. So can you apply operant conditioning to your, I should say imaginary, school, college or educational setting? So you can pick whatever you want. So you could design exactly as you have done your classroom here, or do you want to make it much broader? Do you want to make it a school-wide reward system? Don't forget you can include parents in that, things outside of class. So anything at all that you think you might include that students it might help produce the behaviours that you want to see.